Hello. Welcome, everybody, to the second part of this joint series between the Einstein Shul Synagogue and the JPN about navigating the hospital on Shabbos. The shiurim are being given by Rabbi Kaminetzky, the Rav of the Einstein Shul. And this second part is going to be about the nafkaminas of the practical differences between of the chuya, which was discussed in the first year, as well as the 4 different types of illnesses or cholim on Shabbos. Rabbi Kaminetzky is going to start in one moment. I'm going to add the links to the WhatsApp group for people to ask questions throughout the week, as well as the JPN guide to navigating the hospital on Shabbos. Without further ado, Rabbi Kaminetzky.
Thank you so much, Yoni, and thank you to the entire team of the JPN. And I only realized over the last week, since the beginning, since I started this, since last week, a bunch of people have reached out who I didn't know. In addition to many follow-ups from people from Einstein, which was great. I also followed up with a lot of people who I didn't know before. So Yasher Koach to all the people involved in the Jewish Physicians Network for creating this platform, and hopefully this platform will just be Ma'abek Vot Shemayim, and will continue for people, as I mentioned last week, to be able to uphold and constantly reiterate and appreciate the ultimate value of human life and the tremendous mitzvah that everyone here is pursuing in terms of saving lives and being involved with patient care, in addition to keeping Shabbos, which is so foundational, so essential, and HaKadosh Baruch Hu expects us to keep both. And hopefully this series will be able to continue on that trajectory. So without further ado, we're just going to jump right into it. Also, for those who will jump on the Zoom, who might jump on the Zoom, we have people here in Einstein, so I appreciate that, because I like giving to humans. But if people aren't in a compromised position, I like speaking to human beings and not just boxes. So if you want to get on and you're not in a compromised position on your computer, that's also great. So we'll jump right back into it. And I mentioned to people in Einstein and others that even if you weren't at round 1, this will be understandable, and hopefully each part of this series will be understandable by itself. But I wanted to continue some of the things because of some of the follow-up I had, and I wanted to continue some of the discussions and some quick chazara, and also expanding some of the very essential points that we began with last week. And we'll jump right into it. How do we know? And feel free to jump in, anyone on the computer and or of course anyone in person, feel free to jump in. So how do we know? What's the source that Pikuach Nefesh is Docha Shabbos? I mentioned last week that there are 2 sources. One is the pasuk quoted by Reb Shimon ben Menashe, "V'shamru b'nei Yisrael sa Shabbos, la'asos sa Shabbos." What is that pasuk that we mention every Shabbos? That b'nei Yisrael keep Shabbos, la'asos sa Shabbos. The goal of keeping Shabbos is not just to keep Shabbos, but it's in order to la'asos sa Shabbos, to keep Shabbos in the future. So therefore, the reason you'd be able to violate Shabbos for Pikuach Nefesh, the reason you'd be able to violate Shabbos in order to save a life is so that you could sort of give up on this one Shabbos for this person in order to be able to keep many, many more in an unknown amount of Shabboses even afterwards. And that's the first source for Shomer Bnei Yisrael Shabbos, Chalal of Shabbos Achas, Kadesh Yishmor Shabbos Harbe. Just break this Shabbos so that you'll be able to keep many, many more afterwards. And the second source that we saw was from Shmuel, which was V'chai Bahem. V'lo Shiyamas Bahem, when the pasuk says that you should keep the mitzvos, it says V'chai Bahem. The goal of the mitzvos isn't so we die for them. No, the goal of the mitzvos is to live with them, through them, by them. The goal of the mitzvos is in order to live. And we mentioned that there's a bit of an nafkamina between these 2 sources. What's the practical difference? Perhaps if someone would not be keeping Shabbos in the future, that might have been an nafkamina if you believe that for whatever reason, this person would not be keeping Shabbos in the future. So we mentioned then, and I wanted to clarify that the Mishnah Berurah and the Be'er Halacha, the Chavetz Chaim points out, in a case, the context of which is that someone who is under a building that fell down, and it appears that he only has a few moments left, and he won't necessarily make it to the next Shabbos. So it would seem that's a good nafkamina for these 2 sources. Nevertheless, the Mishnah Berurah points out, he says, in the bold on that second source. All those understandings of it only being to keep future Shabbosos is just a reason given. But me'ikar adin, this doesn't have to do with actually keeping mitzvos. The enatam dachina mitzvah achas b'shvil harbe mitzvos, ela dachina kol mitzvos b'shvil chaim shel Yisrael. It's not just about keeping mitzvos in the future. We generally always violate Shabbos in order to save lives. So we would even save a life of someone who would not necessarily be keeping Shabbos in the future. And that's what we learn from the Be'er Halacha. So that's important for that nafkamina. We also mentioned a nafkamina the other way. What about a case of a fetus, for example, which might not necessarily be alive? And that you might have the other way around. B'chai b'hem might not apply because it's not necessarily alive, this fetus. It's true that we would say if a fetus is in danger, necessarily in the vast majority of cases, the mother is in danger as well. But this fetus, how would we be able to violate Shabbos in order to save the fetus? We could say, and it is used, according to the Ramban, in Torah Sa'adam, he quotes the Bahag as saying that the reason that we'd be able to violate Shabbos to save this fetus is because of this pasuk of Vishamru B'nai Yisrael in order to keep Shabbos in the future, and that's extremely important. And I mentioned last week as well, and just to clarify that also, that that violating Shabbos, although the above sources do, according to the Rishonim there, specifically apply to Jewish people, this also, the idea of breaking Shabbos in order to save a life, this also would extend to non-Jews. It's true that the Mishnah Brura in Siman Shimid Lamed, Sif Ches, does in fact point out that the concern of Eva, the concern of creating hatred, would be limited to only Isurei D'Rabbanan. Reb Moshe Feinstein, Reb Shlomo Zalman, Rabbi Yashiv, all categorically reject that. They say it doesn't make so much sense, and they confirm that we violate even Doraisas, just like we would for a Jew, for non-Jews, because the Eva that it could cause would ultimately lead to Pikuach Nefesh for Jews. The Rav and Rav Lichtenstein are quoted as violating Shabbos for non-Jews for perhaps more fundamental reasons, but nevertheless, for our purposes, the Psak is the same. We would violate Shabbos for non-Jews as well. The question, the nafkamina might come to what our kavana should be when we're doing so. Rav Willig has suggested that perhaps someone's first time in the hospital, they should have explicit kavana, at least in their minds, that the goal of being here is pikuach nefesh is general pikuach nefesh for Am Yisrael, and then we covered all our bases. But the topic of what our kavana should be in pikuach nefesh is definitely beyond the scope of what we're dealing with now. But I did see an excellent article by Rabbi Josh Flug on that topic, if anyone wants to take a look. I think it's on YU Torah. But so that is what we saw there. But we said not only the case of Pikuach Nefesh, not only the case where someone's obviously dying, where someone's life is obviously in danger, would be a case where we'd violate Shabbos, but also a case of Suffolk, also a case of that we would be, and we also mentioned that we'd be Machal Shabbos B'Safek, and Rashi on that Gemara and Yuma already points that out, and he says, why do we like the source of Shmuel? Why do we like the source V'chai B'hem? Because it includes the concept of Mechalin ala Safek. I said in the bold on the third source, Rashi points out, based on that Gemara, that the source of V'chai B'hem would even include being Mechal Shabbos, if even it's a Safek, if even it's a doubt whether this person's life is in danger, but even a Safek we would violate Shabbos for. And how does he read that pasuk? Because in Rashi's words, the source of V'chai B'hem means V'chai B'hem that you should do the mitzvos in a way that will certainly bevadai make you live, as Rashi says here, Asher yasa adam mitzvah sheyiche behem vadai. Someone should do the mitzvos that they will vadai, they will certainly be able to live. The goal of the mitzvos is to not even put you in a situation to be in a case of suffix, to be in a case of potentially threatening your life, and that's what V'chai B'hem teaches us. Alma Mechalin ala Safek, even a suffix. And the question that we asked, that I want to clarify again, based on excellent questions afterwards, is what exactly does the word suffix mean? Suffix means doubt. So what exactly does a doubt mean? Does it mean 1 in a million? Does it mean 50-50? What exactly does a suffix mean? Obviously, a suffix pikuach nefesh. Anyone could come up with a case how just a simple headache. Oh, it might be a brain hemorrhage. It might be something more. It might be something more severe. So how do we know what a suffix is? So, and the truth is, Tosas already asked this question in a different context in Psachim, when that Gemara is talking about the concept of hoil, which is not our topic, but the concept of cooking and perhaps preparing on Yontif for for a different day or for Shabbos, when it's talking about cooking and preparing for a different day, Tosfos asks a good question. And he says, why don't we say that you should be able to cook on Shabbos, violate a doraisa, because maybe someone who is a cholesh yesh bo sakana, someone whose life is in danger, might show up on my block and might need exactly what the doctor ordered. They might need a bowl of chicken soup. It's possible, right? There's a possibility that if I make a hot cup of tea on Shabbos, which is certainly an Isser doraisa, it's possible that someone might show up and it'll help someone who's in a case of pikuach nefesh. So, and Tosfos already there points out, no, Kevan in the bowl, Kevan lo shiach klal lo amrin and hoel. That's not something that happens. We're not going to say hoel in that case. So this is just an example of a case. That's the Tosfos and the fourth source on the page. We're not going to say hoel. We're not going to say that case, that's a case of suffix that we would violate Shabbos for. We're not going to say that. And Rabbi Kiva Eger also is quoted in a tshuva that says 1 in 1,000 is definitely not considered a suffix sakana for these purposes. He uses the words 1 in 1,000. So what is a suffix? I mentioned last week, but that background is important. The Rav Shlomo Zalman says something that, again, I think is intuitive, but it's extremely important. And we could read it. We could read it inside, just the bold. He says, mitzad hasvara. I assume, elashe mitzad hasvara nira la'aniyas daiti. I assume shekol shederech rov b'nei adam livrach mizeh kiborech mipnei hasakana. What does suffix mean? That anything that's the normal way of people to run away from this, as if they do normally from sakana, from a danger, harei chashuv kisafik pikuach nefesh. Anything that people in a regular situation would consider a case of pikuach nefesh. If this is something that you would rush to the hospital for on a Tuesday, then you should do so on Shabbos. If it's something that's way less severe than that, then you also wouldn't violate Shabbos for that, right? So if most people, and obviously this is somewhat subjective, it depends on your situation, it depends on who you are, it depends on who your community might be, but if most people in your situation, in this situation, would rush to the hospital in this case, again, on a Tuesday, so too would you on Shabbos. But you're not going to say some far-fetched idea that I'm going to rush to the hospital for a very, very distant possibility of suffix. But so that's an important Rosh Shlomo Zalman to again understand that the case of Safek Pikuach Nefesh is what's normally considered something that would be considered a life, something that's a threat to one's life, and that's the case of when we would violate for even a Safek Pikuach Nefesh, which comes from that pasuk of V'chai Bahem. Good. So I wanted to expand this a little bit and expand on something that I mentioned last week based on again some conversations that we mentioned in the Shulchan Aruch in the next source, that the Shulchan Aruch says that kol sheregilin lasos lo b'chol, in the case of a suffix, in a case of pikuach nefesh, in a case of cholesh yesh bo sakana, those are the same thing, by the way. Pikuach nefesh, someone whose life is in danger, and a cholesh yesh bo sakana is the exact same thing. We could use them interchangeably, but just so we know the terminology, it's important. Pikuach nefesh and cholesh yesh bo sakana, or even a suffix, cholesh yesh bo sakana, or a suffix pikuach nefesh, are really all considered in the same category. So in those cases, we mentioned that the Shulchan Aruch points out, Osim kol sheregilin lasos lo b'chol. Shulchan Aruch says that whatever is the standard form of care for this person, that's what you would provide. And that's absolutely true. And that's an accurate representation of what the Shulchan Aruch says. And the question is, what is that? And the question is, what is that limit? Is there a limit to that? I mentioned last week the example of, obviously, if someone is not able to breathe and you have to hook them up to a ventilator, that's a case of saving their life. But then we have the standard form of care for someone in the ICU, for someone hooked up to a ventilator. You would even be able to take their heart rate. You'd even be able to check things that you know, or you could assume in the vast majority of cases, it's not going to help save their life. It's not going to fix things one way or another by checking their heart rate. But nevertheless, we would still do that because it's a standard form of care in this category that's somewhat known, that I put on the top there, is called tzarachav. You'd be able to do all the needs of this person, and you'd be able to do, again, the standard form of medical care. You'd be able to take their vitals and other things, even though you can't necessarily say this is what's going to save their life. You're going to do things that are normal to do for this patient. And that's what the Shulchan Aruch points out. And the question is, what's the limitation for this? Is there a limit for this? And the answer is yes. That there is a limit to this, and the question is, how far does kol tzarachav go? The Mishnah Berurah, as we mentioned last night, he says umashma sha'af al pi in the next source. Kol shiragin lasses machalam urufuas. He says in cases of foods and therapies, whatever you normally would give to this chola sheyesh bo sakana, this patient, whatever you would normally do, you do now. Umashma sha'afal pishe im bo sakana b'minias hadavar, even though there's no danger necessarily by not providing this thing or not giving this treatment. With this thing, since this is a chola sheyesh bo sakana, the yesh bedavar tzorach, and it does have some value. It has some added value. Regin lasos b'chol osin gam b'Shabbos, and it's something that's normal, and it does provide some value to him. Then you would do it b'Shabbos. But we'll see. But as you could probably be medayik, the Mishnah Berurah does limit that. He says, anything that you know, that's obvious to you, it won't help one way or another. Even though it might be something that he wants or needs, but it won't help at all. And even it's something that maybe you'd normally do, you would not be able to violate a doraisa. You'd be able to do amira l'nachri, just like a chola she'ein bo sakana. He says, which we're going to get to. You treat that like a case of chola she'ein bo sakana, and we'll see what you could do for chola she'ein bo sakana. But you cannot violate a straight doraisa. So the question is, where is that line exactly of kol tzarachav? Where is the line of something that's the standard form of care, but something that they don't need? So it seems from a number of poskim that the medical care, and this is why there perhaps is a difference between doctors and others, that the medical care necessary, or the classic taking of vitals, or the taking the heart rate, that's all things that actually that you could say is tzarach tzas, even though, again, this person's not breathing. I know it's a lung issue. I could still take their heart rate. I could still do what's normal in this circumstance. You could even use Rav Asher Weiss's claw. I don't think you need it, but you could use it. Rav Asher Weiss is quoted in a number of places, and I've heard him say it to Zoom to doctors on during COVID. I didn't listen then, but I listened recently. But he mentioned that there's a big concept of pikuach nefesh of the Rabbim, that takes on somewhat different that pikuach nefesh for the Rabbim takes on different parameters of pikuach nefesh for this yachid, and hospital policies and going through this form of care that the hospital says you do for an ICU patient, that's considered pikuach nefesh for the Rabbim, even though you can't point, this heart rate is saving this guy. Going through the normal practice of what you're supposed to do for this patient would be something that's necessary. Again, we're going to get back to Hutra Dechuya and whether it would be better to have a guy do it or something else, but you'd be able to do that for this patient. Again, the standard form of care, even though you can't say, this is what saved their life, that you'd be able to do. But other things, like things that the patient would like, but you can't necessarily say that'll help them one way or another. A good example, perhaps, is family coming to visit, right? Could family come to visit? Would family be able to come visit? Obviously, it's a nice thing. They would appreciate it. Other family coming to visit, you can't say that that's actually going to medically help them necessarily. Again, someone who is, and this is obviously sometimes a judgment call, and that's why all these cases you should discuss with a competent Rav, because sometimes it might be the case that the only way that this person is going to be able to overcome this terrible illness is if they see this specific person, and maybe that would save them, and that's why every case should be asked. But as a general rule, family coming to visit, would they be able to violate even a doraisa to come? So I want to separate that question from another important point that, again, is not only a doctor thing, but it's an important point that the Nishmas Avram points out, that he quotes the Nishmas Avram in Simin Shin Vav, Sif Tes, quotes Rav Neubert, the author of the Shmir Shabbos Kilchasa, who said that if for someone to have an advocate is different. For someone to have an advocate in the hospital is actually essential. You guys might know better than me. But sometimes people might be forgotten. For sure, someone who might not have the ability to go and get a nurse or be able to give their history or be able to provide all the necessary information, that person is absolutely necessary. A person who would help this chola sheyesh bo sakana, who would be able to advocate for him and who'd be able to advocate for this chola and provide important details to the doctor. Then it's possible it's ideal that if someone's, for example, going into the ambulance, the other person should just get in the ambulance. That might at best be in Isser D'Rabbanan, to just be an additional passenger in the ambulance. But if for some reason that person couldn't get in, that car with the chol sheyesh bo sakana, that person would probably even be able to violate a doraisa and drive if this person didn't have an advocate. But let's assume the person has an advocate there. Let's assume this person has someone who'll be able to give their history and be able to deal with that issue. What about seeing family would make this person happy? So that seems to be the limiting factor. That seems to be what the Mishnah Berurah is referring to. For that, we would not be able to violate doraisas. The Rabbana might be a different question, but doraisas, in order to go that far, again, something that you can't necessarily say that it would help this person, that would directly help this person in the same way. Again, it's not a medical standard of care. Then you would not be able to go that far. There are opinions who think you might. The Magen Mishnah seems to believe you would be able to go that far and be able to do absolutely anything. Reb Chaim is quoted in some places as going that way, but that's not our general psak. Rav Shlomo Zalman and the vast majority of the modern day poskim seem to say that we would limit it at some point. In fact, Rav Shlomo Zalman's quoted in the Shemir Shabbos Kehilchasa as saying, let me see if I can find the line. It was a great line. He said that, I don't have it. He said, I'll just quote it outside. He said, would we allow someone to bring, because someone was pestering him and asking him what the line of Kol Tzrachav is, would we allow someone to violate a doraisa and bring a newspaper for this person? This person might want a newspaper. We wouldn't let someone, carry an or Rishus HaRabim necessarily and violate a doraisa to bring the newspaper for him. So not all bets are off, and not everything in terms of caring for this person is going to be mutter. And just important, it seems to be the case for Sfardim as well. We're going to get back to Hutra Dechuya, but Sfardim seem to agree that not everything is mutter for every chole. Certain things would not be mutter. So Kol Tzrachav does extend to certain things. Again, like I mentioned, it's not always a doctor situation. There is one case that comes up a lot that is a doctor situation that really requires its own share, but I'll just give the background about stitches. If you have a chol sheyesh bo sakana, someone who requires stitches in order to heal the wound, otherwise the wound is going to get infected, he needs to close up that wound on Shabbos, and that becomes clear medically. The question is like this: in order to heal up the wound, perhaps you'd be able to get away with 6 stitches. You'd be able to heal up the wound, you'd be able to close up the wound and deal with that issue with 6 stitches, but it'll leave a massive scar. If you bring in the right person, you bring in the plastics guy, he would have to do 36 stitches in order to make it good, in order to not leave scar tissue. And if you left it till after Shabbos, then it would leave a good scar. So the question is, would that additional amount of stitches be included in Shar Tzrachav or not? Would that additional, going from, again, assuming this person's already a chol sheyesh bo sakana, not just doing it for cosmetic purposes, then it's extremely likely this person would not be considered a chol sheyesh bo sakana at all, and therefore it wouldn't be applicable to this question. If you assume stitches is a case of doraisa, like Rav Shlomo Zalman and Rabbi Yashiv, which again requires its own share. But if you assume that giving stitches or stitching would be a doraisa, then would you be able to give those additional stitches to this person for the cosmetic purposes? So the Nishmas Avram is quoted as and Rav Shlomo Zalman, the Nishmas Avram quotes Rav Shlomo Zalman that if you assume you're getting stitches because of chol sheyesh bo sakana, then it's a possibility it might be included in kol tzrachav. But again, that line is sometimes difficult, and you should consult a rav in specific circumstances. But that's a good example that might actually come up for doctors, that I think Reb Neuberger mentioned is one of the most common shilas he gets from doctors regarding Shabbos. Okay, so now we realize that a suffix would also be something that we have to worry about and deal with. So what do we do? But both a suffix and a regular case of pikuach nefesh, we would violate Shabbos for. That becomes clear. But how would we go about that? So this came from we mentioned last week the concept of hutra and dechuya. Just to re-up that concept, we said and we established that pikuach nefesh is docha Shabbos, that in order to save a life, we would push off Shabbos. And the question is, how does that work? How would that operate? Do we say that pikuach nefesh is docha Shabbos is hutra? What does that mean? Pikuach nefesh comes and Shabbos is out. It's as if it's literally a Tuesday and we wouldn't have to think about Shabbos, care about Shabbos at all. we wouldn't have to bring Shabbos into the calculus. Again, in the case of a chola sheyesh bo sakana, someone whose life in danger, we wouldn't even have to think about limiting Shabbos prohibitions whatsoever. That's one way of approaching potentially the concept of pikuach nefesh docha Shabbos. There's another way of understanding pikuach nefesh docha Shabbos, which is dechuya. It's true that you have to do what you have to do to save this life, but as best as you can, if you have the ability, without compromising patient care in any way, then should you try to limit your prohibitions of Shabbos, perhaps try to bump it down from a doraisa to a derabanan, or from a worse derabanan to a better derabanan. Would that be a concept? And this comes from the last source on the first page, the concept that comes up on the concept that comes up of in Maseches Yom HaTorah Misha Achzu Bolmus. Someone who has this illness called bolmus, which Rashi points out is a life-threatening disease, that it causes unbearable hunger and impaired vision, and it's a bad disease. And it's certainly a chola sheyesh bo sakana. The person's life is in danger. Machilin oso hakal hakal. You would feed him in a way that which the isser, the most lenient isser, comes first, where the prohibition is least severe. That's how you would feed this person. This person needs food. That's for sure. On Yom Kippur, this person needs food, right? So what would you do? You would give this person the least usser thing first. So he gives examples, tevel and nevela. You have something that meiser wasn't taken from, you had food that meiser wasn't taken from, and nevela, some meat that wasn't shechted. Machino so nevela, you would give him nevela, because tevel, the isser is misa bidei shamayim, that you get killed from heaven, whatever that means, and eating nevela is only malchus. So eating nevela is better than having tevel. So that's why you'd eat nevela. Tevel u'shvius. If you have tevel and something that was shvius fruit, which is usher to eat, then you would have shvius. The Brisa says, because the shvius is only an isser aseh. So this concept of hakala kal tchila, of having something that's most lenient, that's where it really comes from. So we would say, in a case of dechuya, if we would say dechuya, then we would say this concept of hakala kal tchila, try to limit our isurim as best as possible. And this is really a machlokes rishonim. I just gave the psat, but it's important to give some background. There's really machlokes rishonim whether Shabbos is hutra or dechuya. We're not going to read the whole Rush, but the Rush gives an example on this in the beginning, on the top of the second page. The Rush gives the example of a case where someone needs to eat on Shabbos and there's only nevela there. There's only non-shechted meat there, but you could also shecht on Shabbos. This person's a chola sheyesh bo sakana. You could also shecht something on Shabbos. So which one's more severe? Which one's a more severe isser? The more severe isser is violating malacha of Shabbos. That's skila. We just said nevela is only malchus. So obviously it's better to have nevela than shecht on Shabbos. But nevertheless, the Rush says no. You should shecht the animal on Shabbos. You should shecht the animal on Shabbos. Why? Says the Rush in the bold on the top of the second page, and he compares it to a fascinating concept. He says, Pikuach nefesh docha Shabbos is just like cooking on Yontif. As some of you might know, we're allowed to cook on Yontif. And as the Rush explains, there's no concept of limiting our cooking on Yontif. You should only cook one piece of chicken. You should only make one egg. No, there's no concept of limiting it. It's totally mutter to cook on Yontif. So too, says the Rush, it's totally mutter to violate Shabbos for Pikuach Nefesh. So says the Rush, once the Torah allows cooking on Yontif, it's as if it's a Tuesday for cooking on Yontif. So too, once Pikuach Nefesh is mutter, once Pikuach Nefesh, we are allowed to override Shabbos. He says, all bets are off. It's hutra. You'd be able to even shecht this animal instead of doing nevela, because Shabbos is totally mutter now. That's what the Rush says. But the Rashba disagrees. The Rashba quotes the same thing, and he says in the Bo, he leans into our problem. He says this whole question is whether Shabbos is dechuya or hutra, using exactly our terms. That's what this whole machlokes is about. Should you shech this animal, or should you eat the nevela? And the Rashba disagrees. The Rashba says, and it seems the halacha is that Shabbos is dechuya, and therefore you should eat the nevela. And this is the machlokes rishonim. We mentioned last week that the Shulchan Aruch paskins that it seems to paskin that it's hutra. the Shulchan Aruch writes that you should not, we don't have to read this inside, we already did, but you should not try to find someone else to do an Isser, and the Malacha should be done, if a Malacha needs to be done for someone whose life is in danger, it should be done from the Gedolim, which come from the Gemara, that if a Malacha needs to be done, the Gemara says Gedolim should perform the Malacha, says Machlokes in that Gemara. There's a Machlokes in that Gemara, why should the Gedolim be doing the Malacha and not anyone else? Why should the Gedolim specifically be doing the Malacha? So Tosas and the Ran there explained, because if the Gedolim were not to do the Malacha, people would get the wrong idea. People would think Pikuach Nefesh is not Docha Shabbos. If people don't see the biggest people in the community violating Shabbos in order to save this life, people might get the wrong idea. It's kind of like a chinuch idea. But the Shilta Giborim quotes the Riyaz, and he argues on Tosas and the Ran. He says no, because that case in the Gemara is referring to a case where there was no guy available. There was no other option. So it's true, you should have the Gedolim do it when there's no other option, and you should have them save this life, because we know Pikuach Nefesh is Docha Shabbos, but and it seems to be the Ramah paskins that way. The Ramah at least reads the Gemara that way, and that's why the Shilta Giborim explains. But if it's possible to do something in a mutter way, if it's possible to do something in a more limited way, if it's possible to limit the Malacha and do something beheter, obviously that's ideal, and that's how the Machlokes Shulchan Aruch and Ramah bears out. And according to the Ramah, we would limit the Isser, and we pass into Chuya. To the best of our ability, we should try to limit the Isser as much as we can. And now, like I said last time, we should read the Ramah carefully just to make sure what that means. And I need to clarify this just based on some follow-ups. Read the Ramah carefully. V'yesh omer in the bold. Tim efsher lasos below dichoy u below ichor ayadei shinoi. If I could do it without pushing it off in any way, and not sacrificing any time that's necessary for this patient, then you should do it. Ose ayadei shinoi, and then you should do it in a not normal way. You should do it with a shinoi, which is only an issa derabanan. Vim efsher lasoso ayadei akum, and if you could do it through a non-Jew below icher klal, again without compromising anything, osin ayadei akum, then you should do it through a non-Jew in order to deal with this patient. And that's how the Ramah brings down the idea of doing techuya. So in a case where it's bam bam and time is out of the absolute essence, and you absolutely and every second counts, you don't think about this whatsoever. The Ramah would even tell you not to think about this whatsoever, and this is important because the Taz gets very upset about the psak of the Ramah. The Taz says that, how can you say this? You're going to lead someone astray, just like with Tosas and the Ran. You're going to lead someone astray. If they see you trying to mess around and not violate this Doraisa, people are going to think you don't violate Shabbos to save lives, which is absolutely not true. So I think Rosh Shlomo Zalman, so two things. One is that we paskin the Ramah, but we should do what the Ramah actually says. We should make sure that it doesn't lead to any delay or lowering of the standard of care whatsoever. Again, assuming time is of the essence. Oftentimes, time is not of the essence, and this is where this would really play in. This is where this would really play into the circumstance. What is important to note from some feedback, by the way, achol sheyesh bo sakana doesn't necessarily mean that this person is in an emergency and experiencing a terrible emergency, or is coding chas v'shalom right now. It means someone who has an illness that is a sakana. If you were not to treat it, if you were not to continue treatment, their life would be in danger. That's an important caveat, including someone who, we'll get back to the categories, but including someone, for example, who has terrible cancer, and you're providing care to this person. He might be stable right now. There's no emergency happening. There's no one actively treating him right now, but he's for sure a cholesh yesh bo sakana. So there are some cases for sure where time is not of the essence, and this is really where this would come up in the Sefer Madrich Lechevra Hatzalah, which I'll bring up, which is a little dated, but it's an excellent Sefer by Rabbi Handler, and it has a lot of psukim from Moshe Feinstein. Moshe Feinstein had to write, or was told to, or told them specifically, people in Hatzalah, where literally every second counts, not to think about any of this, not to think about techuya whatsoever. Every second counts. Don't try to pull shtick whatsoever. But again, in a case where you can, the psak is that you should limit to the best of your ability. And again, just to note Taz's apprehension, the other point that the Shmir Shabbos, that Rosh Shlomo Zalman is quoted in the Shmir Shabbos in Perek Lamed Beis Sif Chavches footnote Peches, he says that if someone is using a shinoi and has the ability, Rosh Shlomo Zalman says someone is using the shinoi and has the ability to use the shinoi, and again, this could come up if you're, I don't know, turning on the light in the OR or something like that. It's something that you could easily do with a shinoi, hit it with your elbow, something like that. And someone's pulling or to turn on the computer, which you need in order to get up this person's chart or whatever, and you're using the back of your hand. There's some other abnormal way to limit the isser. Then he said you should probably tell the people around you, if there are any Jews around you who might not be at the shir. They should be at the shir, but if they're not, then you should make sure to tell them, I'm only doing this because I have the time and I have the ability, and I would be able to not do this. And I would be able to violate a doraisa in theory, assuming any of those cases are doraisa, which they're probably not. But I would be able to violate a doraisa or a strong darabanan or whatever it is in order to save this patient. And that's just a good eitzah. You should not do something if it's gonna, and you should try to at least explicate why you're doing something if it could lead, and you're under the impression that it would lead to someone blowing it in the future. Okay. So I thought it was a good idea to bring up how would we go about this hakala kal tchila? What would be a good way in order to limit our isurim? So from this Madrich Lechaver Hatzalah, again, I pulled this directly from there. This chart, we're definitely not going to go through each of these cases. This is like learning all of Hilchos Shabbos, so highly recommended to learn all of Hilchos Shabbos. But these are in no particular order. It's their order, but I don't know if they put it on purpose, but I don't see a good order here, so assume there's no particular order. These are 8 ways. I'll just read directly that there are 8 criteria for an action to be considered melechas machshavas. There are 8 things in order for something to be considered a full-blown melechas machshavas, a full-blown melacha mida oraisa. Any melacha performed on Shabbos that is lacking any of these 8 conditions is not considered melechas machshavas and is only rabbinically forbidden. Which again, we don't like violating the rabbanans, but we're talking about, for the record, someone who you can't even violate a doraisa, but you have the ability to limit it. So how do we go about that? What are the ways to go about that? I'm going to blow through these very quickly, not give basically any background for this, but I'm happy to follow up about this. And for those in your own learning, these are all important, good concepts to know about for Hilchos Shabbos and to review and to think about. So I'm just going to blow through these. These are 8 ways to limit your doraisa and perhaps bump it down to a durabanan. Again, in no particular order. The orders of these, you could really give many shirim about which one's better, worse, but we're just going to blow through it. Number 1 is the normal way of performing a malacha, kedarko, and not doing it through a shinoi. For example, writing, that if you're a righty, writing with your right hand is kedarko, writing with your left hand is not kedarko, that would be considered a shinoi. Number 2, that the malacha would be a productive malacha, would be misakin and not a destructive malacha. For example, if you're opening a container in a destructive way, in a way that destroys the container, as opposed to in a way where I just made a usable container that I could put things in and out of, if I open a container in a destructive way, that would not be a malacha mida oraisa. Number 3, it would be a similar purpose to what its purpose was in the Mishkan. Again, that would be called malacha she'ena tzricha legufa. The example given in Chazal is like digging a ditch. Digging a ditch is boneh, you're building a hole, but if you're digging a ditch in order to get the dirt. I'm not applying all these to medical situations, but perhaps you could. So digging a ditch in order to get the dirt would not be a malacha midoraisa because you're not doing it for the purpose of the hole. But you did it just for the dirt, that would be a case of malacha she'ein tzricha legufa. The other case is intentional, with kavana, on purpose. If it's an unintended, I don't know how this come up in a medical situation, we'll just drop it. If it's an unintended side consequence of something you're doing, if you're dragging a not too heavy bench, that it's possible, not 100%, but it's possible that it'll make a furrow, which would be violate the malacha midoraisa of choresh. If it's possible it'll happen, but it's not for sure going to happen, that would be a davar she'ein miskaven, and that would not be asur midoraisa. In that case, it would be mutter, in fact, in a case of davar she'ein miskaven. The number 5 would be miskayim, something that's enduring. There's a lot of details to this, but one example is something that's an enduring malacha. I know that Somet, I think, made this years ago. We'll deal with writing when we deal with writing, but and we'll have our own share for that. But there's a concept I think Somet had of disappearing ink. That there's ink that you could write with, and then it goes away. That doctors would pull that, they would write disappearing ink, and then right after Shabbos, they would write for real all of their notes. So disappearing ink that's not miskayim would not be Malacha midoraisa, probably I heard that it wasn't so effective, that sometimes it didn't work or sometimes it worked too well. So whatever it was, but that's a good example of something that's not miskayim. That wouldn't be an asur doraisa. There are different types of miskayim, but for now, we'll stick with that. And malacha that's complete, you do a full malacha that comes up by hotzah. If you fully bring it in and bring it out, not go full into that, and not only do half the malacha. We'll leave it at that. That's number 6. Number 7 is doing something directly, meaning as opposed to grama. What's the case of grama? The case that Chazal bring up, the case the Shulchan Aruch quotes, is if there's a fire, which you should put out because it's dangerous. And oftentimes this case doesn't come up because every second would probably count if there's a dangerous fire. But in theory, the case of the Shulchan Aruch, if there's a fire, instead of just directly putting it out, then you could line up water bottles around the fire, and then the fire will extend to the water bottles, break the water bottles, and then the water will, the rado will begrama indirectly end up taking out the fire, and that's one way of accomplishing the same goal in an indirect way called grama. The other one is doing the malacha alone, levad, as opposed to having 2 people. If it's a malacha that could be done independently, but you do it with another person, then it might not be the same level of isser. In fact, that might be still asur midoraisa, but it might be just a patur onesh, but it would be a better way of breaking it down. Those are those situations. We're not going to go too much into any of them. I'm sorry, but I thought that was just a helpful chart for people to have in order to bump things down. Okay. So moving on to the types of choles, and this is important because it might not always be so intuitive that all these choles, we've been talking about Yeshua Sakana, just a few more points about Yeshua Sakana, and then when we get to the other point, it seems there are 4 types of chole. Just a few more points on chole sheyeshbo sakana, which we've been talking about, someone who has a case of pikuach nefesh. First of all, we have in this mechaber that no matter what, you would be mechal Shabbos for chole sheyeshbo sakana, even if only one doctor said you should be mechal Shabbos, and not every doctor there, even if it's not the full consensus of everyone there. If someone thinks it's a good idea, like we mentioned from the Shlomo Zalman, if someone thinks it's a good idea to violate Shabbos for this person because their life is in danger, then you would do it. That's that first source that we don't, on the top of page 3, that we don't have to read inside. Another important point that I already mentioned before, that it doesn't always mean someone is a chole sheyeshbo sakana, or oftentimes it does not mean that they're actually experiencing an emergency. But it includes people whose life would be in danger, someone who, if you needed to, again, you could most of the time schedule cancer surgery or chemotherapy, radiation treatments. But if for some reason it was medically necessary to have those things on Shabbos, that too would be permitted, even though this person in theory could be walking around and living their life in whatever way possible. Nevertheless, this person obviously is considered a chole sheyeshbo sakana, or someone experiencing heart failure, severe pneumonia. Again, even if they're stable, but it's clear that without treatment, their life would be in danger, then they're classified as a chole sheyeshbo sakana. Another important point that comes up through all these types of choles is you don't have to wait to jump up a category. If you're a chole she'ein sakana, which we're going to define, but without this treatment, you would quickly become a yeshbo sakana. Without this, perhaps medication or perhaps this thing, you'd become a yeshbo sakana. We don't have to wait for your life to be in danger in order to give you treatment. We could jump in on it right now. Rosh Shlomo Zalman says that a few times, and you could do that. You could do that math. If we say that someone, for example, I'll cheat now. If you say that someone has only a bad headache now, which you wouldn't be able to even give them medicine. If someone only just has a light headache now, let's say, which you wouldn't be able to give them medicine for in any way, but they could tell that it's a migraine's coming. A migraine's coming, and it's gonna debilitate them. It's gonna incapacitate them, and they need to get on their medication now. You wouldn't have to wait to be incapacitated to be a chole she'ein bo sakana. You'd be able to get on it right now. So that's an important point. Another point within chole sheyeshbo sakana, though, is a case of a yoledes. And this is important, not necessarily for doctors, but anyone who I've spoken to about this. And some people, we have a spouse here, so this is important for you, for lawyers, or for non-doctors, anyone's case where people first, and this is even in Einstein, probably one of the more common shilas I would get is, we're going to the hospital, my wife's in labor or something right before Shabbos. What do we do? How do we go about that? So a yoledes, someone giving birth, is a little more a little more confusing because the Shulchan Aruch here, the second source on page 3, says Yoledes hikacholish yesh bo sakana. A yoledes, someone in labor, someone who's going to give birth, is considered a yesh bo sakana. Umechalon aleh Shabbos l'kol ma shetzricha. You would be mechal Shabbos. That all makes sense. But the Shulchan Aruch writes, umikol makom b'kol ma sheyacholin l'shanos mishanin. But to the extent that you can, you should try to do a shino. You should try to limit it. And if we remember the Shulchan Aruch from a minute ago, that doesn't make so much sense. I thought the Shulchan Aruch holds hutra. Shulchan Aruch holds you don't have to limit your malacha at all. So why would the Shulchan Aruch here say you should limit it? For specifically a yoledes, a person in a woman in labor. So the Mishnah Berurah quotes the Maggid Mishnah, and it seems this is based on that Maggid Mishnah. It's in the next source. I don't know why it's not bolded, but the Mishnah Berurah says here, he quotes the Maggid Mishnah. He says, "Va'afilu man da'amar b'sim shimcha chesiv sif yud beis degabi pikuach nefesh lo bayashinoi." Even according to the Mechaber, even according to the Shulchan Aruch, who says you don't need a shinoi for chol sheyesh bo sakana, hacha shayni. In a case of a yoledes, in a case of a woman in labor, it's different. Mipnei sheke'eva yoledes davar tivihu. Because the labor pains and the experience of labor itself is a natural phenomenon. The ein achas me'elef mesa machmas leda. This is straight from the Maggid Mishnah, basically that getting pregnant and giving birth is part of natural life, and it's not necessarily a dangerous illness in the colloquial sense. You're not going to call it a regular chol sheyesh bo sakana. And Baruch Hashem also, he points out, based on the Maggid Mishnah, it was the 14th century, that the mortality rate is not that high, and now it's much better than it even was then. It's remarkably low. So therefore, you're not going to treat it in the exact same way. So certainly if not dealt with properly, it could lead to a sakana. And at some point, a woman down the line might have a sakana, and for sure it needs to be dealt with properly. So it's still a chol sheyesh bo sakana. But even the Shulchan Aruch bumps it down a little bit and says you should try to be mishana. And this is an important nafkamina because someone actually asked and tried to apply. This is why it's always important from last week. Oh, if I'm a Sephardi, then the example I gave last week is if I know that my patient who's chol sheyesh bo sakana is going to be in the hospital in a half hour and I have to get there, but I know even an Uber could take me, let's assume that this case of an Uber is going to be just a straight drabanan, and driving my Hummer would be a doraisa. I don't have a Hummer, but maybe one day. Then we would say, oh, that might be a good nafkamina between Ashkenazim and Sfardim. A Sfardim who's going to care for his patient, perhaps wouldn't have to limit their malacha because the Shulchan Aruch holds hutra. But in this case, even the Mechaber, even the Shulchan Aruch, and Rav Avadia confirms this, even the Shulchan Aruch in this case would say that you should try to limit your malacha and you should try to take an Uber. So even a Sephardi going into labor on Shabbos, we would say should be trying to the best of their ability. Again, in a case of where in most cases of labor this is the case, a normal labor, not every second counts always. You have to get there at some point. But anyway, Uber is probably quicker. But even assuming it's not, you could we would say that even a yoledes would be, you should try to limit as much as possible, and that's an important klal for a yoledes. A yoledes is a chol sheyesh bo sakana, but one step below. So the next step is a chol she'ein bo sakana. The second type of chol is a chol she'ein bo sakana. So what does that mean? A chol she'ein bo sakana. This is a case of where someone's sick, but they're not in danger of losing their life. As we said before, pikuach nefesh is docha Shabbos based on b'chai b'hem. Right? We would violate Shabbos in order to save the life. We don't have that in a case of chol she'ein bo sakana because their life is not in danger. So therefore, that's going to be bumped down in a very legitimate way. But how do we define a chol she'ein bo sakana? This is important. Literally, that term means a sick person who is not in danger. But we have better definitions in the Shulchan Aruch and afterwards. Chol she'ein bo sakana, the Shulchan Aruch says on page 3, chol she'nafa machmas choli lemishka ve'ein bo sakana. So someone who falls into bed because of his illness, but still his life is not in danger. So he falls into bed, it seems he's incapacitated. And the Ramah continues on that line, the Haggah, O sheyesh lo michush shemitzta'er v'chala mimenu kol gufa. Even if he has an illness that pains him and his entire body is in pain. Sha'az afal pi sheholech, even though theoretically he's walking around, you don't literally need to be in bed, says the Ramah. Even though you're walking around, we would consider as if you're in bed because your entire body is in pain. this illness is causing your entire body to hurt and feel weak or sluggish, and therefore you're considered basically incapacitated. So you would fit into this category of a chole she'ein bo sakana. The Aruch Shulchan gives an even more exact, I think, definition, just coming off of what we just saw, not disagreeing. He says in the next source, Mishi Yishlo Michush Ayadeza Nechlash Kol Gufo, that through this illness, someone who has an illness, that through this his entire body will hurt. Va'avshem eschazik b'holech, and this is important. Chole she'ein bo sakana means nafal mishkav. You have to be in bed. No, even if the person could overcome it, right? The person could get over it in theory, even though he could be walking around. In theory, achilucho bechvedus uvechalishas. If he manages to walk, he's doing it heavily and with a lot of weakness. V'dino kenafal mishkav b'chol she'ein bo sakana. That's going to be the same din as a chole she'ein bo sakana. So what do we do with this person? So that's the definition of a chole she'ein bo sakana. It seems the person's incapacitated, not able to operate in the normal way that they operate, perhaps like the flu or a severe migraine, something like that. This is a step above a basic headache or a tummy ache or something like that. Stomach aches, I know we're like doctors, or the more official terms for these things. But this is a chole she'ein bo sakana, again, something that's debilitating them, but their life isn't in danger. So what could we do for a patient like that? What could we do for someone like this? So uncharacteristically, actually, the Shulchan Aruch, which we're not going to read, gives 4 options. He gives 4 different opinions. Again, we are not going to read that. He quotes 4 different opinions. There's massive stiras and stuff in Shas about what a chole she'ein bo sakana could do, but we're just going to quote the psak here of what could be done for a chole she'ein bo sakana. For our purposes, we're only going to focus on his 3rd opinion that he quotes, which is the Ramban. I mentioned last week, the Ramban Torah Sa'adam is a medical halacha book. The OG medical halacha book, the Ramban is really one of one in so many categories in everything that he writes, and including medical halacha. So the Shulchan Aruch paskins the Ramban, which we're not going to read in the Shulchan Aruch, but in the next source, the Mishnah Brura quotes it when he says a svar shlishis. The Shulchan Aruch says, I like my third pshat better. So what's his 3rd pshat? What could we do for a chole she'ein bo sakana? Hainu, says the Mishnah Brura in the 3rd source in this section, in Shin Chav Ches Sifkat Nun Zayin, Hainu shemuter lasas afilu kol hashvusim. You could do any derabanan v'rak ayadei shinoi. So you could do a derabanan with a shinoi. So if it's an iser derabanan, you could do that in an abnormal way, not a straight derabanan, but a derabanan in an abnormal way. Imucholi kol aguv ve'im bo sakanas aver. We'll get back to sakanas aver if he's not in danger of losing a limb. Ve'im yesh bo sakanas aver. Again, we'll get back to that. Then ein tzar shinoi klal. You could do that. And ein tzar shinoi klal. And he quotes v'chein perish hataz and Magen Avram and the Gra. Everyone paskins this Ramban. Everyone seems to say this is a psak about chole she'ein bo sakana shedezu ikar shehidas rov haposkim. So what could we do? Halacha l'maisa for a chole she'ein bo sakana. So first of all, you could do amira la'akum on everything. Amira la'akum, you could even do on a doraisa. You would be able to do an amira la'akum for this person. So you'd be able to ask a non-Jew to violate a doraisa for you. You'd be able to do this as well. As we just said, you'd be able to do a malacha d'Rabbanan, but only with a shinoi. And the Mishnah Brura writes in the next source that in Kuf Beis, that if it's not possible to do without a shinoi, if perhaps in order to treat this chole she'ein bo sakana, if it's not possible to do without a shinoi for whatever reason, you could do a derabanan straight. He paskins va'ain sham le'el in the next source, the ayidei Yisrael mutter dafka ayidei shinoi, that if a Jew is doing it, again showing that you could ask a non-Jew to do it, amir la'akum is totally mutter for a chole she'ein bo sakana. Even on a doraisa, you could have a non-Jew in theory cook for you or something like that, if this patient would need it. So if this person absolutely needed a cup of tea or something, you could do amir la'akum on that. But if it would actually help, a cup of tea might be a bad example. But if you needed a non-Jew to violate a doraisa for you, you would be allowed. That would be a derabanan for you. But they would be able to even violate a doraisa. Sorry. back to the Mishnah Berurah that I was just quoting. So you'd be able to do adishun. You could even violate a drabanan without a shinoi if it's impossible to do it with a shinoi. If it's impossible to do it in an abnormal way, you'd even be able to violate a straight drabanan for this chola she'ein bo sakana. You'd be able to do that for a chola she'ein bo sakana. What about a case of violating a doraisa with a shinoi yourself? It seemed to be from the Mishnah Berurah you would not be able to do that, to violate a doraisa even b'shinoi. But if there is a tzorech and there's no guy, again, this is just halacha l'maisa. If there's a tzorech and there's no guy available and there's no ability to do a derabanan or to do a derabanan with or without a shinoi, again, that's the approach here. Ideally, amir l'nachri on a amir l'nachri. Even if it's a doraisa, that's ideal. Then you could do a malacha derabanan with a shinoi. Then if you can't do a malacha derabanan with a shinoi, you could do a malacha derabanan without a shinoi. And then if you can't even do that, Ushmir Shabbos kehilchasa, quote some poskim in Perek Lamed Gimel Sif Beis, that quote some poskim who are matir even violating doraisa with the shinoi, including the Shulchan Aruch Harav, the Eglei Tal, the Ketzos HaShulchan, who are matir that b'makom tzorech to even violate a doraisa b'shinoi if it was absolutely necessary. And Rosh Shlomo Zalman says you could rely on this again if it's necessary and there are no other options available. Rav Shechter and Rav Willig agree to that, and this is based on a reader of the Ramban of this shita that we hold of, on a reader of the Ramban that really me'ikra adin. Perhaps this would also be mitzvah violating a doraisa with a shinoi. Straight doraisa, no. V'chai b'hem is only for someone who's actually in a pikuach nefesh. But in a makom tzorech, perhaps this too would be mutter according to many poskim, including according to the Shmir Shabbos Kilchsa, according to Shlomo Zalman Auerbach, in a case in a makom tzorech where there's no other options. That's the chola she'ein bo sakana. It's important. I know I didn't give the order of the 8 things I mentioned in the Madrich L'Chebra Hatzala, but it's a good question about what order those are in. The order I gave before is important. I want to clarify that it's not so clear if you look at all the lumdas. Is amira la'akam and a doraisa better than a shino and a derabanan? It's not so clear. One's like a 2 derabanan, one's a derabanan on doraisa, so it's not so obvious. And again, it's not clear what case that would be. If you need something to happen, then it would probably be the same halacha. But in theory, it's a good question. Amira, this is the psak. Amira is the name of the game. I spoke to a number of poskim about this in a practical way, and also otherwise. If you're not doing something directly, it's always better. To find a non-Jew, even on the doraisa, is always better. Amir la'akam is always the best way to go, as opposed to a shinoi on whatever, even if it's a derabanan. Amir la'akam is always the best way to go. In a practical way, it's the easiest to remember. You don't have to think, is this derabanan doraisa? Because for sure, in some settings, you won't be able to think about that unless, hopefully everyone learns Hilchos Shabbos very, very well. But either way, Amir la'akam is always the best approach in these situations. I spoke to Rav Willig, Rav Sobolowski, Rav Neuberger, all agreed that Amira is the best way to go. It seems that many poskim would say that as well. Amira seems to be the best mahalach. In these cases, again, when you would be able to limit it, when you'd be able to have a non-Jew do it, that would be the best way to go. Good. Another point in a chola she'ein bo sakana is a child. A child. What the definition in the second to last source on page 3 says the Shulchan Aruch, says the Rama, mutar lo la'akum lasos tavshil lakatan she'in lo ma'alecho. You would even be able to do amira to a katan, for a katan, on behalf of a katan, who doesn't have what to eat. Says the Rama in the bold, distam tzarchei katan kechola she'ein bo sakana dami. Any child's needs, the needs of a child, is already considered a chola she'ein bo sakana. Even if he doesn't have a debilitating illness like an adult would need, a child's needs are a chola she'ein bo sakana. So you could plug all those heterim into what you could do for a child. What does a child mean? It's machlokes. Could be up to 3 years old. There are poskim who say even up to 9 years old. I like the mahalach that Rabbi Yashiv gives, which really is case dependent. 3 is definitely the if it's below 3, you're good to go. But some cases, depending on what the kid could and depending on what the kid's abilities are in this situation, then it depends on whether they be called a chola she'ein bo sakana here. But stam tzarchei katan is a chola she'ein bo sakana dami. This comes up a lot in halacha, that katan, even if the katan is not experiencing a debilitating illness, everything we mentioned earlier, a katan is considered let's just say a 2-year-old for now, because that's agreed according to everyone. But like I said, there's a range. A katan is considered a chole she'ein bo sakana. In all circumstances, that's an important point. The other heter is refuah. We've been talking about refuah this whole time. We've been talking about being doctors this whole time. There's another isser on Shabbos called refuah. Whoa, there's an isser to basically the isser refuah, which we're not going to deal with because that's really the least concern for doctors. We'll get back to this in a second, but it would be mutter to do refuah. What does that basically mean for our purposes? You'd be mutter to take medicine as a chole she'ein bo sakana. We'll see in a second. You can't do that if you just have a michush ba'am. If you have a regular headache, you'd be able to give this person medicine. You'd be able to violate that, or that gzera doesn't apply to a chole she'ein bo sakana. And the question that everyone asked, that the Mishnah Berurah asked here on the bottom of page 3, and everyone focuses on, why would refuah be mutter? It's gzera midrabanan. It's a gzera. Why would you not be able to give someone medicine? It's a gzera that maybe you'll come to grind up the medicine. You might ask, we don't grind up medicine today. Okay, there are answers to that. One of them is that, okay, the Rambam already says that we don't get rid of gzeras, even if the tam doesn't always apply, but the Tzitz Eliezer and others point out that's not necessarily so true. There's still home remedies. There's still situations in which this gzera, meaning even if there was a Beis Din that could theoretically undo this, it's not so obvious that they would undo this, but so refuah would be mutter for a chole she'ein bo sakana. Why? It's a derabanan. It's a straight derabanan. We said straight derabanans, at least l'chachila, are not going to be mutter because there's two types of derabanans. Rav Shefter talks about this a lot, and the Mishnah Berurah points this out already on the top of page 4, that there are two types of derabanans. There is a derabanan. There's a derabanan that's asur mishum malacha, and I'm just saying it outside, but the Mishnah Berurah says here there's a derabanan that's asur mishum malacha, which is similar because it's similar to an isser d'oraisa. That's one type of an isser d'Rabbanan. There's another isser d'Rabbanan that's asur mishum gzeira, that if you do this thing, it will lead to another thing. That's like refuah. If you do this, it'll lead to tochen. It'll lead to something else. That's a gzeira. So not all d'Rabbanans basically are created equal. That's the idea. Again, Rav Shefter in Bikvei Atzon talks about this, and he often talks about this. Not all d'Rabbanans are created equal. Some are gzeiras, and some are mishum malacha d'oraisa, and those are not all created equal. And that's why something like the gzeira of refuah would be mutter in the circumstance of a chole she'ein bo sakana. Why would the Rabbanan allow that? Perhaps because of the Gemara in Ksuvos that says b'makom tsar lo gazir Rabbanan. In certain cases of pain, in this serious pain, a chole she'ein bo sakana, the Rabbanan are not going to apply that gzeira to that situation. So that is why the refuah b'Shabbos, the way it's colloquially understood in halacha, giving someone medicine basically would be mutter in all ways, in all circumstances, for a chole she'ein bo sakana to take Advil, Tylenol, whatever they needed, or any other medication that they would need for a chole she'ein bo sakana. Again, a case of a flu. We're not going to give all the situations, a case of a flu, or a difficult illness, that doesn't necessarily put someone in danger. I'm not going to mention fever because I don't want to get called out by any doctors, and I'm not going to give numbers, but it seems fever is something that could hit on all the categories, depending on how mild or severe it is, and depending on what the background is. I already see faces, relax, but let's just say, meaning there are fevers that everyone would probably agree could get up to a chole she'ein bo sakana. Let's say like 104, 105 is already getting to yesh bo. If you don't know where it's coming from, and let's say you just have a wound or something, and it doesn't make sense to have a fever like that, that would get into chole she'ein bo sakana territory. If you know where it's coming from, you have a bad headache or something, or a migraine, and you know it always comes with a fever that's like not necessarily so bad, and you know it always comes with a fever, you have a headache and it comes with a light, mild fever, then that would probably be more in the chole she'ein bo, or a migraine, that would probably be more in the chole she'ein bo sakana territory if you have a fever. But obviously fever is its own sugya, and we're not getting too much into that, but fever I know is a big discussion. And obviously it depends what causes the fever. So if you know, then that would obviously be a good way to plug it in. Good. So that's chole she'ein bo sakana. Good. So the other situation, which is less lamaisa, is a sakanas aver. What does it mean, sakanas aver? Literally, it says someone who's in danger of losing a limb or an organ. But Nishmas Avram points out that doesn't necessarily literally mean the medical term of limb or organ. And when we say in the Misha Beirach for refuah, we say, to ramach evarim, to the 248 limbs that someone has. It's not referring to that. the Nishmas Avram points out that it's not really true that it's referring to losing a limb or an organ. We would say it's really any body part. So not the English medical term of a limb, but any distinct part of the body, let's say, is a sakanas aver if that thing is in danger, if that distinct part of the body is in danger. What does that mean in danger? Not just if it falls off, not just if your hand would chas v'shalom fall off, but even if it would be a partial loss of use long term. The Nishmas Avram gives the example of walking with a limp long term, bad situations, breaking a finger and losing flexibility in your finger if something's not set properly, losing the flexibility in your finger long term. Your finger's not falling off, but you would lose the full use of this. That would all be considered a sakanas aver. The question is what to do with a sakanas aver, and that's really based. And I quoted the Shulchan Aruch here in a bold, Vim yesh bo sakanas aver osim below shinu. So what do we do for a sakanas aver? We could even do a derabanan without a shinu. We could do a straight derabanan. There's a big machlokes about what category sakanas aver is in. There's a big machlokes, and it's all based on this next Gemara in this situation. We're just going to give very quickly the background because it's getting late, but we're going to see this Gemara. This Gemara says, Nafar par Shmuel v'daresh. Par Shmuel was dorish ayin shemarda, an eye that explode. Technically it rebels, but eyes don't generally rebel on us on purpose. But an eye that explodes, maybe even falling off, maybe it's a little gross, an eye that's really in danger, the eye itself, mutter lekochla b'Shabbos, it would be permitted to give this dye, this blue dye, perhaps an ointment on Shabbos. It sounds like from the context of the Gemara, it would even be mutter to violate a doraisa, to bring it on Shabbos. It would be mutter on Shabbos to provide for this, to heal this eye. My taima, asked the Gemara, why would this be allowed? What's the reason that you would allow this treatment on the eye on Shabbos? The shuryaina de'ena be'uvnasa deliba talu. Because the shuryana, the tendons, or shirayna, shirene, whatever it is, the tendons of your eye are connected and dependent on uvnasa deliba, on the valves of your heart. Because really, anytime your eye goes out, your heart is also going to go out. Now, I know we're doctors here. I don't know all the full medicine behind this, but what the assumption of the Gemara, the assumption here is that the eye is connected to your heart, which could put your life in danger. So apparently, I did see from just some, don't yell at me, but just from some research that this would be the concept of the oculocardiac reflex. If you know what that is, great. If not, I'm not really going to explain it, but apparently it means that the nerves in the eye are really connected to the system around the heart. And there was some study that I saw that said one of the approaches of EMTs, if they have no other approach, might have a way of slowing someone's heart rate by pressing around the eyes. So maybe this does have some medical background that the eyes are connected to the heart in some way, but there are really two ways to read this Gemara. So one way of reading Gemara, which is the way the Meiri reads it, is that this eye is really representative of all the Avarim, of any distinct part of the body. If that's about to go, then we assume your whole life is in danger, violate every doraisa. That's one way of reading it. The other way of reading it, which we paskin, the Rush and the Ran say this, say, no, only the eye. The eye is specific, the eye is connected to the heart, but every other Aver, like your finger, whatever, which isn't connected to the rest, which isn't connected to your heart, which isn't going to put your life in danger, that you would only be able to violate a derabana. You wouldn't be able to violate a doraisa. So this is the machlokes. We paskin the latter. In theory, a sakana aver, you'd only be able to violate a derabana, but there's a very, very important caveat that we need, which is the next source, which is why this is less lemaisa. Like I said, by the Nishmas Avram says a very, very important point that the case of sakanas aver is very, very uncommon and unlikely. As he says, and I put the whole thing in bold, ubizmanenu, in our time, shekemat ein lecha sakanas aver shelo krucha gam besakanas kol haguf. Nowadays, you probably can't distinguish any case of just sakanas aver, of a limb or a distinct body part that's about to go, without it also affecting the rest of the body, ayudei har'ala ukedome, through infection or something else. The word harala is a hard one, but that's why you look it up. But through an infection or something else, if a limb is about to go, if someone's body part is about to go, it creates tissue. It creates dead tissue, which could really cause problems for the rest of the body if any part of the body goes. So even if your finger is about to fall off, whatever, it's just your finger. But even if it's just the finger, then it could really cause infection. It could really affect the rest of the body. So this does not come up a lot. So he says, Nikra zeh sakanas kol haguf. So that case, therefore, would be called a sakana for all the body. Mechalanis Shabbos achola kazeh. You would be mechal Shabbos for this type of chola. Gama yidei Yisrael v'afilu b'Yisuri Torah. Even a Jew, even an Isser Doraisa, we would bump it up to chola sheyesh bo sakana. So in theory, if you could find a case of sakanas aver that would just be the aver, be limited to this aver, and not affect the rest of the body, then you'd only be able to violate a drabanan. You wouldn't be able to go up to a doraisa. In practice, says in Ishmas Avram, Dr. Abraham, that in practice, this is very rare that you'd be able to limit a case just to that aver and it wouldn't affect the rest of the body through infection or otherwise. So that's why sakanas aver is less classic. But clearly, there's this. So just to be clear, sakanas aver is close to a chol she'ein bo sakana plus a little bit that you could violate. So it's a little more makel than a chol she'ein bo in terms of what you could do. Then chol she'ein bo sakana, you could violate a straight drabanan, but nevertheless it doesn't come up often. Perhaps in a case of teeth, it's a big machlokes, but we're not getting into that. What teeth are is its own sugya, which is an interesting one. The last source, which we're going to spend the least time on, but this is probably the most interesting for non-medical professionals. The reason we're not going to spend is because this is called Shabbos in the hospital. There are very few of these, probably, although you could tell me, there are probably very few of this next category of michush ba'alma in a hospital. You probably won't see this or won't be dealing with this category unless they just haven't been discharged yet. But if people in this category are sitting in the hospital, that's probably a mistake. If they haven't been discharged yet, that's this. But these are the people who are really the targets for the Isser of Refuah. For the Isser of Refuah, what does that mean? A michush ba'alma, someone who just has a general pain, a general illness. Says the Shulchan Aruch, someone who has a little bit of pain, but he's able to walk around, he's able to function normally. Then this is the target audience of the Isser of Refuah, which we're not getting into. It's really its own share because again, this isn't really a doctor. There's more of the a regular people halacha to know. Rabbi has a whole sefer on really just this, the Isser of Refuah, and this is really what medicine is about. But someone who has a headache, a mild stomach ache, something, they're in pain, but it didn't debilitate them. They'd be able to function, but there's a little bit of pain. You can't violate anything for those people, and you wouldn't be able to even do Amir La'akum or a Drabanan with a Shinoi, any of that. You wouldn't be able, and the Isser of Refuah, you wouldn't be able to give them medicine. There are at least 7 exceptions to the Isser of Refuah, which again, we're not getting into. I'll just give 2 examples. One is that if you crush it into their food before Shabbos, then it would be mutter. The other one is if it's machal briim, even if you're doing it for refuah purposes, something like drinking tea. If it's something that normal people do, it wouldn't be considered an isser of refuah. There's a lot more, but again, we're not getting into it. Michush ba'alma is this other category. You really can't violate anything. The Aruch Shulchan makes it even clear about what type of person this is. The next source of michush ba'alma, michush berosh o b'meyav. He has a headache or inside a stomach ache o b'leiv. Obviously, this isn't like a heart attack, or someone whose chest is hurting a little bit. So he's walking around healthily, just like there are people who are weak a little bit because they have a shield, they have a cough, and things like that. They're able to function, right? The other chol she'ein bo sakana was incapacitated. This is capacitated, right? People who are able to function properly, they're just in a little bit of, they have a headache, they're in a little bit of pain. The headache, if it gets up to a migraine, like we said, or if you know it's going up to a migraine, then you could deal with it now. But if you're not a migraine person, you're just sticking with the headache thing, then you're a michush ba'alma, there's nothing we could do. Ba'asr lasasam refuah, says the Aruch HaShulchan, there's one caveat within it. Some people split it into 5 categories because of this caveat. I want to say 4 categories. It's not really the biggest caveat, but the Mishnah Berurah points out if, just in the next source, the last thing we're going to see, and then we're going to stop, is that there's one, I guess, 4a within michush ba'alma. Aval im bekol gufo, says the Mishnah Berurah, eino chol klal, rak shu chole be'echad me'evarim. If you have some pain within one of your evarim, v'gam ba'oso ever ain't sakana. So it's not a sakanas ever, but you have a much more severe cough, you have a much more severe headache that's not yet incapacitating. It's a hard line, but you're experiencing pain. Then you're still not going to be able. He says, lo shari lechalel. You wouldn't be able. Sorry, the only thing that this person would be able to do, which we would call a mixas choli, a little bit of a choli, not a choli she'ein bo sakana, would be amira on a derabana. They still would be aser b'refuah. They wouldn't be able to take medicine or anything, but amira on a derabana. That person would be able to have amira on a derabana. In theory, the az ayidei yehudi nasa shvus to shvus v'sharv mixas chola. So a double derabanan, i.e., amira l'nachri on an iser derabanan, that would be mutter for a case of mixas choli. That's one exception, a little bit, to the case of michush ba'alma. Someone who has a little bit of pain, someone who has again, they still wouldn't. The main thing is they still wouldn't be able to violate the iser of refuah. But that's the last exception or category within Milchus Ba'alma. But like I said, that's less common for doctors to deal with, which is why maybe it'll get its own share at some point. But we're going to leave it at that for Milchus Ba'alma. So these are the categories of cholim, and I know that was a lot of information, but for sure it could apply to many situations. And feel free to follow up and apply and speak to a competent Rav if you want to apply this in the field. Thank you so much for learning together, and yeah, have a great night.